Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the Washington Commanders. We're going to talk about what Dan Synder owns, what percentage, how he gained that percentage, what he paid for it, and what he stands to gain on the sale. Notably, this podcast will not include anything about the recent complaint filed by the District of Columbia Attorney General against a civil complaint that was filed recently against the Washington Commanders, Dan Synder, Roger Goodell, and the NFL. That's a separate topic, maybe in a future episode. This is going to focus just on the finances of how the Washington Redskins were purchased, when, why, where, what the partners are, who the partners are, and what it might be worth today. All right, so let's get into it. In 1999, Dan Synder purchased a majority interest in the Washington Commanders, which of course were the Washington Redskins at the time. He was a very young man. He's still relatively young, but in his 30s. He purchased a majority of the team. So he purchased a majority ownership in the team and the stadium. The stadium at the time was Jack Kent Cooke Stadium, and Jack Kent Cooke was the late owner of the team. And Dan Synder purchased that majority stake in the team from the estate of Jack Kent Cooke. Purchased his majority stake for $800 million. He himself put up $120 million in cash. This is according to the Washington Post in 1999. He put up $120 million of cash himself. His family members put up an additional $90 million. And then he had a couple minority partners, Fred Drassner and Mort Zuckerman, who went in with him to provide some additional equity in purchasing the team. Interestingly, in this 1999 article by the Washington Post, Dan Synder immediately says that he does have intention to sell the naming rights to the stadium, which of course he does famously to FedEx. And he ends up doing that in 1999 for a 27-year deal worth $205 million. So FedEx paid $205 million for a 27-year deal to have the naming rights on the stadium where the Washington Redskins and then Commanders played. Now, of note on the name, even in 1999, there was question about the name. Of course, now it's changed, but even in 1999, that was something that reporters asked was, did he intend to change the name? And at the time, he said no. Now, let's fast forward. So that's happened in 1999. Let's fast forward to the next sort of major change in ownership stake. In 2003, Synder sold at that time a little over 20% of the team for $200 million. Now, he sold that percentage of the team to Fred Smith, who's the founder and CEO of FedEx, and to Dwight Scharr and Bob Rothman. And that group bought a little over 20% at the time in 2003 for $200 million. Now, with that $200 million, Dan Synder paid down debt. The Washington Redskins at the time had $450 million in debt, partly from the purchase of the team, and he intended to get that down to $250 million with the proceeds of the sale. This was lauded by the NFL because the NFL prefers very low debt levels on teams, and in this case, this brought the Redskins at the time out of the top 10 in terms of debt-laden teams and brought them more in line with what the NFL wanted. So that was the initial stake was 20% for $200 million. Now, potentially in that agreement or in another agreement in 2005, that stake went to 40%. I'm sure more money changed hands, and that Fred Smith, Dwight Scharr, and Bob Rothman group combined had about a little over 40% in the Washington Commanders, in ownership of the Washington Commanders. So we'll fast forward to 2020, 2021 type time when it was reported that the NFL gave a debt waiver of $450 million to the Washington Commanders, which allowed Dan Synder to buy out those three men for $875 million. Now, some of what led to that was that group of three individuals had tried to sell their stake to another set of investors for $900 million. That sale was blocked by Synder, and the reason he could block it was he had he had a right of first refusal on this 2005 agreement that stemmed in part from this 2003 agreement. He had a right of first refusal. Now, what they argued, this group, Fred Smith, Dwight Scharr, and Bob Rothman, what they argued was that Snyder blocked the sale, but then he only offered to buy Fred Smith and Bob Rothman's stake and not Dwight Scharr's stake. And they argued that that was not him fulfilling his right of first refusal appropriately. It wasn't kind of apples to apples, and that it wasn't a true right of first refusal that he engaged in. That went to court, and then the NFL, additionally, it's reported on by the Washington Post, got involved in facilitating this transaction of some sort, but a lot of those documents are under seal, and even a large part of the complaint that Fred Smith and that group filed is also, under seal, and there's a lot redacted. But basically, they viewed that this right of first refusal wasn't ratified in an appropriate manner. Snyder viewed that it was. They went to court effectively, and the result of that is that you can see in 2021, the NFL raised the debt limit for the Washington Redskins to sort of facilitate this transaction and sort of get this litigation behind them. So the three partners were bought out. Snyder and the Commanders were able to borrow some money to do that. And after that transaction was complete in 2021, Snyder and a couple of his family members effectively own the entire team 100%. So Snyder himself owns, roughly 81%, and then some family members own some other stakes. Now, interestingly, if you do the math on that, $875 million for 40.49%, that puts the value of the whole franchise at roughly $2.1 billion. Now, of course, that's not a controlling stake, and there's some sort of premium that's going to go on that. But as we've seen in multiple reports, the premium on that is going to be extremely substantial. It's looking like most likely the Washington Commanders are going to sell for something in the neighborhood of $7 billion. Of course, recently the Denver Broncos sold at 4.65. The Carolina Panthers sold at $2 billion plus, and every subsequent sale of an NFL team seems to set a new record. And of course, the Washington Commanders, being in Washington, D.C., being in that market, surely will set a record well beyond that $4.65 billion. So at 100% ownership with some level of debt that's approved by the NFL, Dan Synder and the family will make a significant amount of money in the sale. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed a little history of the recent ownership of the Washington Commanders, and we'll see what happens coming up in the sale. But that gives you a little backdrop for what it looks like, who's selling who, to whom, for what. Thank you so much for joining us here on the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast, and we will see you next time.